The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There already exists within standing orders the right of the government to truncate the period for report back from Select Committee to less than the normal 6 months. This special debate that we're having today is where the government doesn't just truncate it to that extent, but they truncate it to an unusual and normally unreasonable extent. And the reasons why standing orders were changed with unanimous acclaim across Parliament to have this sort of debate when that happens is because that is truncating one of the few protections that we have in our unicameral parliamentary system against rushed and inappropriate legislation being passed. Mr Speaker, we have one House of Parliament. We don't have an upper house that considers legislation, again, as most Western democracies do, including Australia and Canada and Great Britain, United States, to name but a few. So we are more reliant upon the processes that we run through this single House of Parliament than most countries that have more than other countries that have more than one House of Parliament. And that's one of the reasons that lies behind this rule. Now, why do we have these rules? Well, one of the greatest protections that we have in society against inappropriate change by governments is actually time. And it takes time for civil society to get their heads around change that is proposed once they see the detail of it and respond to it. So you have to give time to civil society to come up with their views as to whether what is being proposed is good or bad and how it might be improved. The normal Select Committee process, which allows 6 months, then results in Select Committees normally giving submitters 6 weeks to reply to legislation with their written submissions after the date of advertising. So there's normally 6 weeks of advertising throughout all the major daily papers. Now, what happens in that 6-week period, and why is it 6 weeks? Well, it's generally because many of the organised groups, I'll go back a step, most of, not all, but most of the most valuable submissions that come to Select Committees come from reputable organisations who are themselves representatives of large groups of interested New Zealanders. Those organisations are generally volunteer organisations. They're not paid bodies. They're bodies like the New Zealand Law Society and the Society of Chartered Accountants or the Child Poverty Action Group. All of these groups and the people who provide the services, who write the reports that are going in as submissions, are normally volunteers doing this in their spare time. Not only that, they're normally organisations that are responsible to membership-based organisations, and so they can't just do things off their own bat, but they've got to seek the authority of the organisation that they are representing. These organisations often only meet monthly. So the organisations need a month to make a decision and at least 6 weeks, including that month, in order for them to go through their normal monthly cycle, decide to make a submission and decide what should be in the submission. And if you don't allow that 6-week period following advertising, you are effectively severely frustrating the ability of civil society to participate in the lawmaking process. And we all, I think, in all sides of this House agree that Select Committees make for better legislation as a consequence of those processes. So when we have the government truncating these processes, that's actually what they're attacking. They're attacking the democratic process of making good legislation in a country that already has very scant protections because we're a unicameral legislation parliament where all of the power, or just about all of the power, is already held by the executive wing, the government wing, who control the agenda and can push things through if they want. So against that background, sir, I have to reflect, is this an appropriate case to truncate those timeframes given the consequences that I have outlined? And Mr Speaker, that's why the Labour Party opposes this severe truncation, not just the shortening that can happen within standing orders, but breaches the rule that this Parliament agrees is the standard rule and means that we should have this debate. And that's where you do actually have to come back, not to a debate about the merits of this bill, but to a debate about the complexity of this bill and the issues that it addresses. Now, this bill fundamentally changes the rule about whether you should tax capital gains on housing. It introduces some arbitrary periods. Now, will submitters want to get their head around the issue as to whether there are some important tax principles that are being changed, and if they are being changed, whether they're being changed properly, whether they're in favour of those changes or opposed to those changes? They should have time to get their head around whether this is right. And this is a fundamental change. The Labour Party might say that it disagrees as to the detail of those changes as to how the government sees it, but I would think we both agree that they are actually very significant and complex changes. So, Mr. Speaker, that's one area that really submitters should have the full time to get their head around and submit upon. Then there are the questions that government members raised around what they say is the sophisticated way it deals with the issue of trusts. We know from our experience in this House with the pecuniary interests register that we have to comply with, that even after those rules or those laws that apply to us as parliamentarians have been around, I think, over 6 years now, it's probably even 9 years, with many iterations. Actually, the rules around trusts still aren't right. They're still not right. And I like to think I know a bit about something, and including about trusts, and we still haven't got that right in the example of our pecuniary interests in terms of who effectively exercises control of trusts. Actually, that includes people who have got the right. Includes the people who have got the right to appoint trustees or change trustees. We haven't got that right in our own rules. I doubt we've got that right in this legislation. I don't know that because I haven't had time to consider this yet, but by God, that's an area of complexity that we can't get right for ourselves after 9 years, and yet we're expected to believe that everyone will get their head around this. The government's got it right first time through IRD, and that line is drawn properly. Well, I think that's another example of complexity that deserves further consideration. The changes relating to the Land Transfer Act. I'm someone who's called for some time to use that point of control which arises when you can't take title to a property you can take equitable title, you can't take legal title to a property until you've transferred that at the Land Registry Office. And you can impose rules on lawyers that say that they can't transact something until they're certifying that something's being done. And so I've long thought that right, and the documents that surround the notices that are given to the valuation department and the rating authorities, that there's an opportunity there to gather data. I think that's there are some practical ways there to gather data, but are we going far enough? Again, it's an appropriate question. Are we doing it properly, and are we going far enough? My understanding is that there is a proper argument to be had that we need to measure what's already in overseas ownership, not just what is going to be of those purchases that are transacted after the date of this legislation, that we should have a decent idea of what has already happened. Mr. Speaker, there are proper, more fundamental debates to be had here in a country that's moved to the point where more than half of all people now live in, all people over the age of 15 now live in rented accommodation. There's a proper debate to be had from people who are worried about this as to whether this is an adequate response. Those people should have time to form a view and make submissions. So, Mr. Speaker, I think, and then there is all of the issue of detail as to whether, even if the policy's right, is the detail implementing the policy properly. And we see time and again where that goes wrong. Mr. Speaker, obviously if this was not a rushed initiative, as other people have said, this would have been introduced at the time of the budget, because it was the most significant announcement at the time of the budget. The fact that it wasn't introduced at the time of the budget is because it wasn't ready. We had all sorts of other less relevant information passed under urgency, shows it wasn't ready. It is rushed, therefore the dangers are even higher than they normally are. This select committee period ought not to be truncated.
I call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy